in the scorching deserts of southern Iraq, where temperatures regularly climb past 120 degrees Fahrenheit, something impossible hides beneath the sand. For over 5,000 years, the ruins of ancient Mesopotamia have baked under the relentless sun, slowly revealing secrets that challenge everything we thought we knew about human origins. But what if I told you that satellite technology has just uncovered something that mainstream archaeology cannot explain? Something that suggests the very birthplace of humanity itself might be buried right here, in the valley where the Tigris and Euphrates rivers converge. 2019. NASA releases a series of satellite images as part of their ongoing archaeological survey program. The images show the southern Iraqi desert from orbital altitude, using synthetic aperture radar technology that can penetrate several meters below the surface. What these images reveal sends shockwaves through a small group of researchers who know exactly what they're looking at. Massive geometric structures buried beneath the sand. Not small settlements, not primitive villages. We're talking about urban complexes covering areas the size of modern cities, arranged in patterns that suggest sophisticated planning and astronomical alignment. Structures that predate the earliest known civilizations by potentially thousands of years. The mainstream media barely covered this discovery. A few academic journals published dry technical papers, but here's what they don't want you connecting. These buried structures sit at the precise location described in the world's oldest written accounts of paradise. The Sumerians called it Eridu. The Akkadians knew it as the dwelling place of Enki, the god of wisdom and creation. And if you trace the geographic descriptions found in ancient Mesopotamian texts, you arrive at exactly the same coordinates where these satellite anomalies appear. Now, before we go further, let's talk about something most people don't know. The biblical story of the Garden of Eden? It's not the oldest version of that story. Not even close. 1,500 years before the book of Genesis was written, the Sumerians had already recorded their own creation account on clay tablets. They called it the Eridu Genesis. And unlike the biblical version that speaks in metaphors and poetry, the Sumerian account reads more like a technical report. It describes the creation of humans in a specific location. It provides geographic markers. It names the rivers. And when modern researchers actually bother to follow these ancient directions, they lead directly to the convergence point of the Tigris and Euphrates, to the region the Sumerians called the first city on Earth. Here's where it gets disturbing. In 1849, British archaeologist William Loftus became one of the first Westerners to excavate the ruins of ancient Eridu. What he found terrified the Victorian establishment. Temple foundations that showed no signs of primitive development, no crude earlier versions, no learning curve. Just suddenly, impossibly advanced architecture appearing fully formed in the archaeological record around 5400 BC. The structures demonstrated knowledge of mathematics, astronomy, and engineering that supposedly didn't exist for another 1,000 years. Loftus documented everything meticulously. His findings were published, caused a brief scandal among biblical scholars, and then were quietly buried in academic archives, where they've gathered dust ever since. But Loftus found something else, something that only appears in his personal journals, never in his official reports. Cuneiform tablets describing what the Sumerians called the Abzu, the underground sweet water source where Enki performed the creation of humanity. The tablets don't speak of this as mythology or religious symbolism. They describe it as a physical location with specific architectural features, a place where the gods possessed knowledge of genetics and biology, a place where humans were designed, engineered, brought into existence through intentional intervention rather than gradual evolution. Fast forward to today, those same regions remain some of the most restricted archaeological zones on the planet. After the chaos of 2003, when the Iraqi National Museum was looted and 15,000 artifacts vanished into the black market, international excavation in southern Iraq essentially stopped. The few teams granted access work under heavy military supervision. Their findings passed through multiple levels of government approval before publication. And researchers who've worked in these restricted zones, speaking off the record, tell stories of discoveries that never make it into official reports. Structures beneath structures, artifacts that predate accepted timelines. Evidence of technological sophistication that shouldn't exist in the archaeological record of ancient Mesopotamia. Hey, I'm Mr. H, and if you're intrigued by these mysteries that mainstream history seems determined to ignore, you're in the right place. We're going deep on this one, connecting evidence that spans from ancient tablets to modern satellite technology, from suppressed archaeological findings to the very DNA in your cells. Make sure you're subscribed and hit that notification bell, because what we're about to uncover over the next 2 hours might just change how you see human history forever. Now, let's get back to the evidence. The Eridu Genesis tablets describe something that sounds impossible for ancient people to know. They speak of a time before humans, when the earth was young and the gods descended to establish order. They describe the creation of the first cities as part of a deliberate plan, not as the gradual development we're taught in school. And most intriguingly, they describe the genetic creation of humanity, using the blood of the gods mixed with the clay of the earth. For centuries, scholars dismissed this as primitive mythology, the fantasy of ancient minds trying to explain their origins. But what if they weren't being metaphorical? What if the Sumerians were describing actual events using the only vocabulary available to them? What if clay meant raw biological material? What if blood of the gods meant genetic information? What if the entire story is a technological account translated into Bronze Age religious language? The implications are staggering. Because if the Tigris-Euphrates Valley truly represents the birthplace of humanity, not just of civilization but of our species itself, then everything changes. The Out of Africa theory, the timeline of human evolution, our entire understanding of who we are and where we came from, all of it would need to be reconsidered. And maybe, just maybe, that's exactly why certain discoveries remain buried, both literally and figuratively, in the sands of Mesopotamia. The Sumerian King List. If you've never heard of it, you're not alone. Most history textbooks skip right over this archaeological bombshell, and once you understand why, you'll see exactly why mainstream academia prefers to keep it in the footnotes. This ancient document, inscribed on clay tablets and stone prisms dating back to around 2000 BC, does something that makes modern historians incredibly uncomfortable. It lists the rulers of ancient Sumer in chronological order, starting from the moment kingship supposedly descended from heaven. And the numbers attached to these early rulers, they're absolutely insane. We're talking about kings who ruled for tens of thousands of years. The tablet states this matter-of-factly, with the same documentary tone used for later, historically verified kings. Before the flood, 8 kings ruled for a combined total of 241,200 years. After the flood, the lifespans gradually decrease, but we're still seeing rulers with reigns of 1,200 years, 900 years, 600 years. Then, suddenly, around 3000 BC, the numbers drop to normal human lifespans, 30 years, 40 years, numbers that make sense. The standard academic explanation? Mythology mixed with history. Propaganda to legitimize royal bloodlines. Symbolic numbers representing dynasties rather than individuals. But here's the problem with that explanation. The Sumerian king list doesn't read like mythology. It reads like a bureaucratic record. It includes mundane details, the names of cities, administrative information, the same dry record-keeping style the Sumerians used for tracking grain shipments and tax collections. These weren't poets or priests writing religious allegory. These were scribes documenting what they believed to be historical fact. And those kings with impossible lifespans? The Sumerians had a specific name for them. They called them the Anunnaki, those who from heaven to earth came, not metaphorically, not symbolically. The texts describe these beings arriving from somewhere else, establishing cities, teaching humanity, agriculture, mathematics, astronomy, metallurgy, writing itself. They describe a hierarchy of these beings, with specific names, specific roles, specific genealogies spanning thousands of years. Anu, the father of the gods. Enki, the geneticist and creator. Enlil, the administrator of earth operations. Ninmah, the chief medical officer. These weren't vague mythological figures. The Sumerians wrote about them the way we write about historical personalities, with detailed biographies and documented actions. Enter Zechariah Sitchin, Love him or hate him, you cannot ignore the questions he raised. This Azerbaijani-born scholar spent 50 years translating Sumerian cuneiform texts, and what he found became the foundation for the ancient astronaut theory. According to Sitchin's translations, the Anunnaki were extraterrestrial beings from a planet called Nibiru, a world with a 3,600-year elliptical orbit around our Sunday. Around 450,000 years ago, these beings came to Earth searching for gold, which they needed to repair their planet's deteriorating atmosphere. They established mining operations in southern Africa and Mesopotamia, but mining is hard work, and after thousands of years, the Anunnaki workers rebelled. The solution? Create a worker race. The Sumerian texts describe this process in remarkable detail. Enki and Ninmah took the blood, which Sitchin interprets as genetic material, from an Anunnaki volunteer. They mixed it with the essence of a primitive hominid already living on Earth, possibly Homo erectus or early Homo sapiens. Through multiple attempts, failures, and refinements described across dozens of tablets, they eventually succeeded in creating the Lulu Amelu, the primitive worker, the mixed being, us, humanity. Now, mainstream scholars dismiss Sitchin's translations as wildly inaccurate, cherry-picked to support a predetermined conclusion. And yes, Sitchin made interpretive leaps that linguists find questionable, but here's what they can't dismiss. The Sumerian texts undeniably describe genetic manipulation. The Atrahasis epic, one of the most complete Mesopotamian creation accounts, describes the creation of humans in terms that sound eerily like modern genetic engineering. The text speaks of mixing divine essence with clay in a purification ritual, combining materials in specific proportions, creating templates from which multiple humans are produced. The goddess Nintu is described as conducting this process in a specially constructed workspace, following precise procedures, with multiple attempts before achieving success. Does this sound like Bronze Age mythology to you? Or does it sound like ancient people trying to describe advanced biological procedures using the only vocabulary they had available? When the text says the gods took their blood and mixed it with clay, what are they really describing? When it mentions purification baths and cleansing rituals before the creation process, is that religious ceremony or contamination protocols? When it describes creating 7 males and 7 females from templates, is that mythology or describing batch production? Let's talk about something even more disturbing. The sudden emergence of Homo sapiens, anatomically modern humans, around 200,000 years ago in the fossil record. Paleontologists and evolutionary biologists have struggled for decades to explain this transition. Homo erectus existed relatively unchanged for nearly 2 million years. Then, seemingly overnight in evolutionary terms, we get Homo sapiens with dramatically increased cranial capacity, complex language abilities, abstract thinking, and symbolic behavior. There's no smooth, gradual transition in the fossil record, no clear evolutionary pathway. Just a sudden leap that defies the gradualist model of Darwinian evolution. Population geneticists call it the cognitive revolution. Around 70,000 years ago, human behavior suddenly changes. Cave paintings appear. Complex tools emerge. Evidence of religious thinking, trade networks, sophisticated social structures. All of it erupts into the archaeological record within a remarkably narrow time window. It's as if someone flipped a switch in the human brain, as if our cognitive operating system received a massive upgrade, and nobody can adequately explain why. Now look at the Sumerian accounts again. They describe the creation of humans as taking place in stages. First, primitive workers with limited intelligence, capable of following simple commands. Then, refinements to the design. The tablets describe the Anunnaki being surprised when early humans began displaying unexpected abilities, learning faster than intended, developing language and abstract thought beyond their original programming. The texts describe debates among the Anunnaki about whether humanity was becoming too advanced, too independent, too dangerous to control. Does this sound like ancient mythology? Or does it sound like scientists describing an experiment that exceeded its parameters? Here's where physical evidence enters the picture. Sumerian cylinder seals, small stone cylinders carved with intricate scenes and used to make impressions in wet clay. Thousands of these seals exist in museums worldwide, and many depict scenes that don't fit comfortable interpretations. You see figures that appear to be wearing what looks suspiciously like modern technological devices, wrist-mounted instruments, handheld tools emitting rays or beams, figures wearing what appear to be goggles or viewing devices. Scenes showing the Anunnaki performing medical procedures on humans, with the humans lying on tables that look remarkably like modern operating beds. The most famous cylinder seal, VA 243, housed in the Vorderasiatisches Museum in Berlin, shows what Sitchin identified as our solar system, with an additional planet between Mars and Jupiter. Mainstream archaeologists insist it's just decorative rosettes around a star symbol, but the precision of the carving, the specific number and arrangement of spheres, the scale relationships between them, it's hard to look at that seal and not see astronomical knowledge that shouldn't exist in 3000 BC. And then there's the DNA question. Modern genetic research has uncovered something bizarre. Human chromosome 2 appears to be the result of two ancestral chromosomes fusing together. All other great apes have 24 pairs of chromosomes. Humans have 23. Chromosome 2 shows clear evidence of being two chromosomes end-to-end, with telomere sequences, normally found only at chromosome ends, visible right in the middle where the fusion occurred. This fusion happened sometime after the human lineage split from chimpanzees, and it happened in a way that's extraordinarily rare in nature. It's the kind of genetic modification that, if you were designing a species, you might engineer deliberately to differentiate your creation from its source material. We also have the mystery of the FOXP2 gene, sometimes called the language gene. This gene regulates the development of brain structures involved in speech and language processing. Humans have a version of FOXP2 that differs from chimpanzees by just 2 amino acid substitutions, but these tiny changes have massive effects on cognitive ability. Genetic dating suggests this mutation became fixed in the human population somewhere between 200,000 and 50,000 years ago, right in the window when anatomically modern humans emerged and when the cognitive revolution occurred. Evolution through random mutation and natural selection, or targeted genetic modification? The Sumerian texts describe all of this. They describe the Anunnaki debating how much of their own genetic material to include in the human design. They describe concerns about making humans too similar to themselves, too intelligent, too capable of challenging their authority. They describe limiting human lifespan intentionally, programming mortality into our genetics to maintain control. And most chillingly, they describe humanity as property, as a created servant race, as workers designed for a specific purpose who eventually exceeded their programming and became something their creators never intended. Which brings us to the most controversial question of all. If the Anunnaki existed, if they genetically engineered humanity, where are they now? The Sumerian texts provide an answer, though it's one that raises even more questions. They describe a great flood sent to destroy humanity when we became too numerous, too loud, too problematic for the Anunnaki to manage. They describe one of the Anunnaki, Enki, defying this decision and warning a human named Ziusudra to build a boat and preserve humanity and animal life. Sound familiar? That's because this story was later borrowed and modified to become the biblical flood narrative. But in the original Sumerian version, it's not about human wickedness or divine judgment. It's about population control and a disagreement among our creators about whether we deserve to survive. After the flood, the texts say the Anunnaki gradually withdrew from direct involvement in human affairs. Some returned to Nibiru, others remained, but took less visible roles, observing rather than openly ruling, and humanity was left to develop on its own, carrying the genetic legacy of our creators, remembering them as gods, building civilizations on the foundations they established in places like the Tigris-Euphrates Valley. We retained fragments of their knowledge, encoded in myths and religious texts, gradually losing the technological context and transforming their history into mythology. But what if the mythology is actually history? What if the gods of ancient Sumer were flesh and blood beings with advanced technology and genetic engineering capabilities? What if humanity isn't the product of random evolutionary processes, but rather the result of deliberate design? Quick question for those of you still with me on this journey. Where in the world are you watching from right now? Drop your location in the comments. And what time is it where you are? Are you watching this at 3 in the morning going down the rabbit hole? 2 in the afternoon on your lunch break? I'm genuinely curious who's out there connecting these dots with me across the globe. And what if the evidence for all of this has been sitting in museums and archaeological sites for over a century, waiting for us to finally connect the dots? Picture this. You're an archaeologist standing in the Iraqi desert, 45 miles south of what used to be the ancient city of Ur. The year is 1854. You've just started excavating a massive mound that locals call Abu Sharain. Your team starts digging, expecting to find the usual progression, primitive settlements at the bottom layers, gradually becoming more sophisticated as you move upward through time. That's how archaeology is supposed to work. That's how civilization develops. Slowly, incrementally, generation by generation, learning from the previous one. Except that's not what you find. Not even close. Instead, at the very bottom layer, the oldest level of human habitation, you discover something that makes absolutely no sense. Sophisticated temple architecture, advanced urban planning, a complex water management system, pottery that shows mastery of kiln temperatures and glazing techniques, tools that demonstrate metallurgical knowledge, and perhaps most disturbing of all, no predecessor, no primitive village beneath this city, no crude early attempts at building, just sudden, complete, inexplicable urban sophistication appearing out of nowhere in the archaeological record. Welcome to Eridu. The Sumerians believed it was the first city ever built on Earth, and the archaeological evidence suggests they might have been right, which is precisely what makes modern scholars so uncomfortable. Carbon dating places the earliest structures at Eridu around 5400 BC. That makes it not just old, but older than any other city archaeologists have ever found. Older than Uruk, older than Ur, older than every Egyptian city. But age alone isn't what makes Eridu impossible. Plenty of ancient settlements date back to the Neolithic period. What makes Eridu impossible is that it appears fully formed, with no developmental history, no learning curve, no evidence of trial and error. It's like finding a fully functional smartphone in a cave dwelling. The technology exists, but it shouldn't. Not yet. Not here. The temple complex at Eridu, dedicated to Enki, the creator god, underwent 18 phases of reconstruction over thousands of years. Archaeologists excavated down through all 18 layers. Each successive temple was built directly on top of the previous one, maintaining the same sacred footprint, the same orientation, the same architectural principles. And here's what freaks researchers out. Temple 18, the oldest one at the bottom, shows the same sophisticated design principles as Temple 1 at the top. No evolution, no development of architectural knowledge. The builders of the first temple already possessed complete mastery of construction techniques that supposedly wouldn't be invented for another 1,000 years. The foundation of that first temple sits on a platform of clean sand, deliberately placed there. Beneath that, virgin soil. No earlier structures, no camps, no trash heaps, no evidence of humans living in this location before the city was founded. It's as if someone flew in, picked this exact spot, said this is where we build, and constructed a complete urban center from scratch with full knowledge of how to do it right the first time. Now let's talk about the water system, because this is where things get really strange. Eridu sits at the edge of the marshlands where the Tigris and Euphrates historically converged before flowing into the Persian Gulf. Ancient Eridu had canals, drainage systems, water channels feeding into the temple complex, infrastructure that required sophisticated understanding of hydrology and engineering. The Sumerians wrote that Enki lived in the Abzu, the underground freshwater ocean beneath Eridu. Modern archaeologists discovered that the temple complex was built over a genuine underground aquifer, accessible through shafts and channels. The ancient builders somehow knew exactly where the water was before they started digging. They designed the entire city around this subterranean water source, with precision that suggests surveying technology or geological knowledge that simply should not exist in the 6th millennium BC. British archaeologist Seton Lloyd spent years excavating Eridu in the 1940s and 50s. His field notes, some published, many still gathering dust in academic archives, described discoveries that challenge comfortable narratives. He found evidence of metallurgy in the earliest levels, not primitive copper working, but sophisticated alloys. He found pottery with chemical compositions that required controlled kiln temperatures exceeding 1,000 degrees Celsius. He found stone tools made from materials not native to southern Iraq, suggesting trade networks or transportation capabilities spanning hundreds of miles. And he found something else that appears in his private correspondence but never made it into official publications. Tablets. Cuneiform tablets buried in foundation deposits describing the founding of Eridu in terms that he called disturbingly technological. Those tablets remained untranslated for decades. When scholars finally got around to working on them, the translations revealed accounts of the Anunnaki measuring the marsh, calculating optimal positions, bringing knowledge from before the flood to establish this first city according to divine specifications. One tablet fragment describes Enki bringing the Me, which Sumerologists usually translate as divine powers or sacred attributes, but which the text describes in terms that sound more like data storage devices or information repositories. The Me contain knowledge of civilization, agriculture, mathematics, astronomy, metallurgy, all the skills necessary to build a functioning urban society. And according to the texts, Enki transferred these Me to Eridu, literally installing the knowledge base necessary for civilization to flourish. Here's something else that doesn't fit. Eridu was abandoned around 2000 BC for reasons that remain unclear. The city that the Sumerians revered as the holiest site in Mesopotamia, the birthplace of civilization itself, just gets walked away from. Later, Mesopotamian rulers, including Babylonian kings, would make pilgrimages to ruined Eridu, performing rituals at the abandoned temples, leaving votive offerings, treating it as a sacred site, even though nobody lived there anymore. Why? What happened to the first city? Why did people leave? And why did subsequent civilizations treat its ruins with such reverence? Some researchers have proposed that environmental changes made the location uninhabitable. The coastline of the Persian Gulf has shifted dramatically over the past 7,000 years. Eridu once sat near the coast, but today it's miles inland. Perhaps changing water tables or shifting river channels made the city unsustainable. But that doesn't explain why it was never reoccupied, why such a strategically valuable location, with all that sophisticated infrastructure, was simply abandoned and left to the desert. Unless the city served a purpose that was completed, unless Eridu was never meant to be a permanent settlement but rather a beachhead, an initial establishment point for something larger. The Sumerian texts describe Eridu as the place where civilization was founded, where humanity received the knowledge necessary to build our own cities. What if Eridu was a training center, a demonstration site, a place where the Anunnaki taught humans everything they needed to know before withdrawing and letting us spread that knowledge throughout the world? Look at what happens after Eridu. Within 1,000 years, cities start popping up all over Mesopotamia. Uruk, Lagash, Nippur, each one demonstrating the same sophisticated urban planning principles, the same architectural knowledge, the same technological capabilities. It's not gradual development, it's replication. Like someone established a template at Eridu, proved the concept worked, then humans copied that template and spread it throughout the Fertile Crescent. Modern archaeologists face a dilemma with Eridu. The evidence clearly shows sophisticated urban civilization appearing without precedent. But accepting that evidence means accepting that either humans made an inexplicable cognitive and technological leap in a single generation, or that knowledge was transferred to humans from an outside source. Neither option fits comfortably within mainstream historical narratives. So instead, Eridu gets marginalized in textbooks, reduced to a footnote, its impossible sophistication explained away with vague references to rapid development and cultural exchange with hypothetical predecessor cultures that nobody has ever actually found. Meanwhile, the ruins continue sitting there in the Iraqi desert, slowly being destroyed by time and occasional looters, holding secrets that could rewrite human history. Recent satellite imagery shows that only a fraction of ancient Eridu has been excavated. Vast areas remain buried, untouched since the city was abandoned 4,000 years ago. What else is down there? What other evidence lies waiting? And given the current political situation in Iraq, the restrictions on archaeological work, the chaos that has consumed the region for decades, will we ever get the chance to find out? Or will Eridu's deepest secrets remain buried, literally and figuratively, because the implications of uncovering them are too disruptive to everything we think we know about where civilization actually began and who actually taught us how to build it? Walk into the British Museum in London. Head to the Mesopotamian galleries on the ground floor. You'll see stunning artifacts. The colossal human-headed winged bulls from Assyrian palaces, intricate cylinder seals displayed in glass cases, cuneiform tablets with ancient shopping lists and administrative records. It's impressive, educational, carefully curated, to tell a specific story about ancient civilization. But here's what the museum doesn't advertise on its visitor maps. Beneath your feet, in climate-controlled storage rooms that the public never sees, sit tens of thousands of additional tablets. Some catalogued, many not. Some translated, most waiting in archival boxes where they've sat for over a century. The British Museum alone holds approximately 130,000 cuneiform tablets in its collection. Of those, only a tiny fraction are on display. Most have never been translated. Many have never been properly photographed or documented. They exist in a kind of archaeological limbo, too numerous for the available scholars to process, too potentially controversial to prioritize for study. And before you think this is just bureaucratic backlog, consider this. When researchers request access to specific tablets that deal with creation narratives, cosmology, or the activities of the Anunnaki, those requests face unusual delays. Permissions get kicked up to senior curators, justifications are required, and sometimes access is simply denied without clear explanation. This isn't unique to London. The Louvre in Paris holds approximately 25,000 Mesopotamian tablets. The Pergamon Museum in Berlin, another 30,000. The Oriental Institute in Chicago, the University of Pennsylvania Museum, the Iraq Museum in Baghdad before the looting, dozens of institutions worldwide, sitting on Mesopotamian collections that dwarf what's actually displayed to the public. And we're not even talking about the estimated 400,000 tablets believed to exist in private collections, purchased on the black market, smuggled out of Iraq during various conflicts, held by wealthy collectors who have zero interest in sharing them with academic researchers. Do the math. We're looking at somewhere around 500,000 cuneiform tablets in existence. Current estimates suggest less than 10% have been fully translated and published. That leaves roughly 450,000 ancient documents that could contain information about human origins, the Anunnaki, pre-flood civilizations, forbidden knowledge, anything really, and we simply don't know because nobody's reading them. Or more accurately, because the academic establishment hasn't prioritized reading them. But some tablets have been translated, and what they contain is explosive enough that you have to wonder if that's precisely why the rest remain locked away. The Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic. 7 tablets discovered in the ruins of Nineveh in the 1840s, translated in the 1870s, and immediately controversial. The text describes the creation of humanity in terms that should not appear in ancient mythology. The god Marduk defeats Tiamat, the primordial mother, and from her body creates the cosmos. Then, from the blood of another god, Kingu, mixed with clay, he creates humanity specifically to serve the gods, to carry out their labor, so the gods themselves can rest. This isn't metaphorical. The text explicitly states that humans were designed, engineered, brought into existence to perform work. When the Enuma Elish was first presented to Victorian England, it caused a theological crisis. Here was proof that the biblical creation story was not original, that it borrowed heavily from earlier Mesopotamian sources, and that those earlier sources described creation in much more materialistic, almost scientific terms. The Church of England scrambled to contextualize this discovery. Academics published papers arguing that the Babylonian account was a corruption of a true divine revelation preserved more faithfully in the Bible. The controversy raged for decades. And then, gradually, the Enuma Elish got relegated to comparative mythology classes, stripped of its disturbing implications, safely contained as just another creation myth. But what about the tablets that didn't get published? What about the thousands of tablets excavated from Babylonian temple libraries that deal with similar topics but remain untranslated? In 1926, archaeologist Leonard Woolley excavated the royal tombs of Ur. Among the spectacular grave goods, the golden bull-headed lyres, the elaborate jewelry, he found clay tablets. Lots of them, inventory lists mostly, records of offerings made to the temples, but also other tablets, ones that Woolley's field notes describe as astronomical texts with unusual content. These tablets referenced the Anunnaki, described celestial observations spanning thousands of years, contained mathematical calculations that Woolley admitted he couldn't understand. He packed them up, shipped them to the British Museum, and they vanished into storage. Modern researchers trying to locate these specific tablets to conduct new translations with better understanding of Sumerian astronomy have hit dead ends. The tablets are catalogued, theoretically, but requests to examine them get bounced around between departments. Some researchers suspect the tablets were reclassified, moved to restricted collections, possibly even removed from the museum entirely. Why would museums restrict access to ancient tablets? The official explanation is conservation. Cuneiform tablets are fragile. Handling them requires expertise. Photography and digital scanning take time and resources. Priorities must be set based on historical significance and research value. All perfectly reasonable bureaucratic justifications. But when you notice patterns, when you see that tablets dealing with conventional topics get processed relatively quickly, while tablets dealing with creation narratives, the Anunnaki, or pre-flood history, consistently face delays, you start questioning whether conservation is really the full story. Then there's the Vatican. The Vatican Apostolic Archive, formerly called the Vatican Secret Archive, until the name change in 2019 because apparently secret sounded too conspiracy-friendly, contains an estimated 53 miles of shelving holding documents, manuscripts, and artifacts spanning 2,000 years. The archive includes extensive Mesopotamian holdings acquired through various means over centuries, some purchased from archaeologists, some donated by collectors, some acquired under circumstances that the Vatican doesn't discuss publicly. Access to the archive is severely restricted. Qualified scholars can request permission to examine specific documents if they can prove their research credentials and justify their need to see original sources. But here's the catch. You have to know what you're requesting. There's no browsing. The catalogue itself is incomplete and cryptic. You can't just say, I want to see all your Mesopotamian tablets dealing with creation narratives. You need to request specific catalogue numbers. And if you don't know those numbers, you don't see the tablets. In 2010, a professor of ancient Near Eastern studies at the University of Rome requested access to a specific Vatican collection acquired from excavations near Babylon in the 1880s. The collection supposedly included tablets from a temple library dedicated to Nabu, the Mesopotamian god of wisdom and writing. The professor's research suggested these tablets might contain astronomical records and creation accounts predating the Enuma Elish. His access request was denied. The official reason given was that the tablets were undergoing conservation and were not available for study. When he followed up 2 years later, he was told the tablets had been moved to a different archive location and proper catalogue records were being updated. 7 years after that, the tablets still have not been made available, and the professor has been unable to determine if they even still exist within Vatican holdings. What doesn't the Vatican want researchers to see? What information could ancient Mesopotamian tablets contain that would threaten the Catholic Church in the 21st century? Unless those tablets provide even more detailed accounts of human creation through genetic engineering, accounts that completely undermine Christian theology about humanity being created in God's image through divine will, rather than through biological manipulation by technologically advanced beings. Or consider the Iraq Museum situation. Before the looting in April 2003, the Iraq Museum held the world's most significant collection of Mesopotamian artifacts, over 170,000 items, including approximately 40,000 cuneiform tablets. When American forces failed to secure the museum during the invasion, looters had free access for days. Approximately 15,000 artifacts were stolen. Many have been recovered through international efforts, but thousands remain missing, including a substantial number of tablets. Now here's where it gets suspicious. The looters weren't random vandals smashing display cases. Witnesses and museum staff reported that the thieves knew exactly what they were looking for. They bypassed less valuable items. They went straight to specific storage rooms. They took tablets from particular collections while leaving others untouched, almost like they were working from a shopping list. Who had that kind of knowledge? Who knew the museum's layout, the catalogue system? Which tablets were valuable on the black market versus which ones were academically significant? And why, despite international task forces and decades of recovery efforts, have certain categories of tablets never resurfaced? Thousands of administrative tablets have been recovered and returned. Hundreds of literary tablets have been found. But tablets dealing with pre-flood history, with Anunnaki genealogies, with creation accounts and forbidden knowledge, those remain conspicuously absent. Some researchers believe those tablets never went to random collectors. They suggest the looting was cover for targeted acquisition by parties interested in keeping certain information suppressed. Intelligence agencies building collections of ancient texts dealing with non-human intelligence, military research programs investigating ancient technology references, private interests funding black market archaeological operations. It sounds like paranoid conspiracy theory until you remember that the CIA and other agencies absolutely do collect and classify archaeological information when it touches on subjects they consider sensitive. There are documented cases of archaeology being classified for national security reasons, and if ancient tablets describe advanced beings creating humanity or technological capabilities that predate accepted timelines, that would absolutely qualify. Meanwhile, in those museum basements and archive storage rooms, hundreds of thousands of tablets continue sitting in their climate-controlled darkness, each one potentially holding pieces of humanity's true history. Each one a possible window into our actual origins, and each one remaining unread, untranslated, hidden not through malice necessarily, but through a system that has no incentive to prioritize information that would disrupt comfortable narratives. After all, why rush to translate tablets that might force us to rewrite every history textbook ever written? Why push to reveal information that would challenge religious institutions, academic careers, and our fundamental understanding of human identity? Much easier to leave them in the basement where they've been for the past 100 years, safely out of sight and safely out of mind. December 1872. George Smith, a junior assistant at the British Museum, is cataloguing fragments of cuneiform tablets excavated from the ancient library of Ashurbanipal in Nineveh. He's piecing together broken tablets like a jigsaw puzzle, matching edge fragments, reconstructing texts line by line. Then he reads something that stops him cold. A detailed account of a great flood sent to destroy humanity. A man warned by the gods to build a boat. Specific dimensions for that boat. Instructions to bring his family and animals aboard. 7 days and 7 nights of catastrophic rainfall. The boat coming to rest on a mountain. Birds sent out to test if the waters had receded. A sacrifice offered after the disaster. Every single element of the biblical Noah story, written on an Assyrian tablet dating to the 7th century BC, copying an earlier Babylonian text, which itself was based on even older Sumerian sources. Smith's discovery electrified the Victorian world. Here was proof that the flood narrative predated the Bible by at least 1,000 years, possibly much more. The story wasn't unique to Hebrew tradition. It was Mesopotamian in origin, and the Mesopotamian version was far more detailed, more specific, more grounded in what reads like eyewitness testimony rather than religious parable. Smith presented his findings to the Society of Biblical Archaeology, and legend says he became so excited during translation that he started stripping off his clothes right there in the reading room. That part might be exaggerated, but the impact of his discovery wasn't. The Epic of Gilgamesh, specifically Tablet 11, containing the flood story told by Utnapishtim, became one of archaeology's most important finds. Not because it confirmed the Bible, but because it revealed that the biblical account was a later, edited version of a much older historical memory, preserved in multiple ancient cultures. The Sumerian version is even older. The Eridu Genesis, written around 2100 BC but describing events from much earlier, tells essentially the same story. The gods decide to destroy humanity with a flood. Enki warns Ziusudra, a king noted for his wisdom and piety. Ziusudra builds a massive boat, saves humanity and animals, and after the flood is granted immortality. But here's what's different in the Sumerian version. The reason for the flood isn't human wickedness. It's not divine judgment on sin. The text explicitly states that humanity had become too numerous, too noisy, too disruptive to the Anunnaki. The gods couldn't sleep because humans were multiplying across the earth and making too much racket. So they decided on population control, total extinction. Wipe the slate clean and start over. Except Enki disagreed. Enki had created humans. He'd engineered us, put time and effort into the design, taught us skills and knowledge. He wasn't about to let his creation be completely destroyed because his colleagues found us annoying. So he defied the consensus, warned Ziusudra through a clever loophole, speaking to the wall of Ziusudra's reed house rather than directly to the man himself, thereby technically not violating the agreement among the gods. And humanity survived. Now, if this was just mythology, just ancient people telling stories to explain natural disasters or reinforce religious teaching, that would be one thing. But here's the problem. There's geological evidence that massive flooding actually occurred in Mesopotamia multiple times, at scales that would have seemed apocalyptic to anyone living through them. In 2000, marine archaeologist Robert Ballard, the guy who found the Titanic, led an expedition to the Black Sea. Using sonar and remote submersibles, his team discovered something remarkable. Ancient shorelines, 400 feet below the current water level, with preserved beach formations, river channels, and signs of human habitation. Radiocarbon dating placed these submerged shorelines around 5500 BC. Ballard's theory? Around 7500 years ago, rising Mediterranean sea levels breached the Bosphorus Strait. Seawater came flooding into what was then a freshwater lake, much smaller than today's Black Sea. The flood would have been catastrophic, raising water levels by hundreds of feet, drowning thousands of square miles of inhabited coastline in a matter of months or even weeks. Survivors would have fled, carrying memories of an apocalyptic deluge that destroyed their entire world. But the Black Sea flood wasn't the only one. Core samples taken from sediment layers in southern Iraq show evidence of major flood deposits dating to around 5800 BC and again around 2900 BC. These weren't normal seasonal floods. The sediment layers are meters thick, covering vast areas, indicating sustained catastrophic flooding that would have wiped out cities and displaced entire populations. The earlier flood corresponds roughly with the time frame Sumerian texts assign to the flood that destroyed the antediluvian world, the world of the kings with impossible lifespans, the world when the Anunnaki openly ruled on Earth. What if the flood narrative isn't mythology at all? What if it's historical memory of an actual catastrophic event preserved in oral tradition for thousands of years before being written down? And what if the details about the Anunnaki deciding to destroy humanity aren't religious symbolism, but accurate recording of what survivors believed happened? Think about it from the perspective of ancient people. Sea levels rising catastrophically fast due to melting ice sheets at the end of the last glacial period. Coastal settlements drowned. River valleys flooded. Millions of people displaced or killed. If you survived something like that, if your entire civilization was nearly wiped out, how would you explain it? If you believed that advanced beings, the Anunnaki, controlled natural forces and human destiny, you'd interpret the disaster as their deliberate action. And if your descendants preserved that interpretation for thousands of years, eventually writing it down on clay tablets, that's exactly the kind of text archaeologists would find, which is precisely what we have. But here's where the cover-up angle comes in. The Iraqi government has been extremely restrictive about excavations in specific flood layer sites. After the Epic of Gilgamesh discoveries in the 19th century generated so much international attention, Iraqi authorities started controlling access to sites that might contain additional flood narratives or pre-flood artifacts. During Saddam Hussein's regime, certain archaeological sites were declared off-limits, even to Iraqi archaeologists. Some researchers believe this was because excavations in pre-flood layers were uncovering artifacts that didn't fit accepted timelines, technology that shouldn't exist in settlements dating to 6000 or 7000 BC, evidence of sophistication that challenged the narrative of gradual human development. In 1929, archaeologist Leonard Woolley was excavating at when he found something unusual, a layer of clean clay sediment, 11 feet thick, with no artifacts, no pottery, nothing indicating human presence. Below that flood layer, evidence of an advanced civilization. Above it, a completely different cultural phase, as if the flood had completely reset society. Woolley believed he'd found physical evidence of the biblical flood. He published his findings with great fanfare. The problem? When other archaeologists tried to correlate Woolley's flood layer with flood deposits at other Mesopotamian sites, they didn't match up chronologically. Different cities showed flood layers at different times, which means either there were multiple regional floods, each catastrophic to the local population but not universal, or the stratigraphy is more complicated than Woolley realized. Mainstream archaeology went with the multiple flood interpretation, which allowed them to dismiss the flood narratives as exaggerated folk memories of localized disasters. But that interpretation ignores a crucial point. The Sumerian, Babylonian, and biblical accounts don't describe a local flood. They describe global catastrophe, waters covering the mountains, total destruction of all life except what survived on the boat. If we're seeing evidence of multiple catastrophic floods in Mesopotamia across different time periods, maybe the ancient texts are composite narratives, preserving memories of several different disasters, each one apocalyptic to the people who experienced it, eventually merged into a single story about the time the gods tried to wipe out humanity and nearly succeeded. And maybe that's exactly why certain excavation sites remain restricted. Because if archaeologists could freely excavate pre-flood settlements, if they could study the full technological and cultural sophistication of these drowned civilizations, they might find evidence that supports the ancient texts in ways academia isn't prepared to accept. Evidence of knowledge that was lost and had to be relearned. Evidence of a reset in human civilization, a deliberate destruction followed by a rebuilding phase where survivors had to start over, preserving what knowledge they could, but losing the technological base that had supported it. The flood happened. Multiple floods, actually, catastrophic events that shaped Mesopotamian history and human development. The texts preserve memory of these disasters with remarkable accuracy, but they also preserve an interpretation of why those floods occurred, an interpretation that involves non-human intelligence making decisions about humanity's fate, and that's the part that makes everyone uncomfortable, because if the disaster was natural, we can fit it into our understanding of geology and climate, but if it was deliberate, if beings with advanced technology made a conscious decision to destroy human civilization and nearly succeeded, then we have to confront questions about who really controls human destiny and whether we're as independent as we'd like to believe. 1994, a Kurdish shepherd named Savak Yildiz is walking his flock across a hillside in southeastern Turkey, about 9 miles northeast of the city of Şanlıurfa. He notices something odd, jutting from the soil, carved stone. He mentions it to locals. Eventually, word reaches German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt, who's working on nearby Neolithic sites. Schmidt takes a look, starts doing test excavations, and within weeks realizes he's stumbled onto something that will force archaeology to rewrite human prehistory. He calls the site Göbekli Tepe, which translates to Potbelly Hill. But there's nothing cute or harmless about what's buried there. What Schmidt uncovers over the next 2 decades of excavation is perhaps the most important archaeological discovery of the past century, and it directly connects to everything we've been discussing about the Tigris-Euphrates Valley and the true origins of human civilization. The mainstream dating is undisputed. Göbekli Tepe was constructed around 9600 BC. Let that sink in for a moment. 11,600 years ago. That's 6,000 years before Stonehenge. 7,000 years before the Egyptian pyramids. 8,000 years before Sumerian cities appeared in the archaeological record. And here's the part that breaks every rule we thought we understood about human development. Göbekli Tepe was built by hunter-gatherers, people who supposedly had no permanent settlements. No agriculture, no cities, no complex social organization. Yet somehow these primitive nomads quarried, carved, transported, and erected limestone pillars weighing up to 20 tons each, arranged them in circular enclosures with sophisticated astronomical alignments, and decorated them with intricate relief carvings of animals, symbols, and abstract designs that demonstrate artistic mastery and symbolic thinking. Schmidt himself admitted the site made no sense according to established archaeological theory. The standard model says agriculture comes first, then permanent settlements, then surplus food production, allowing specialization of labor, then monumental architecture. Göbekli Tepe reverses that entire sequence. Monumental architecture came first. The site shows no evidence of permanent habitation. No houses, no domestic refuse, no storage facilities. People traveled to Göbekli Tepe from significant distances, constructed these massive stone temples, performed rituals or ceremonies we can only guess at, then left. And they did this for over 1,000 years, continuously building new enclosures, burying older ones, maintaining this site as some kind of sacred center long before agriculture or cities existed. Unless the standard model is completely wrong, unless Göbekli Tepe wasn't built by primitive hunter-gatherers at all, but rather by survivors of an earlier advanced civilization, or by humans working under the direction of beings who possessed knowledge and capabilities far beyond what Stone Age people should have had. Look at where Göbekli Tepe sits geographically: southeastern Turkey, at the northern edge of the Fertile Crescent, looking down over the plains where the Tigris and Euphrates rivers begin their journey south toward the Persian Gulf. This isn't random. The site occupies a strategic position overlooking the entire region that would later become the cradle of Sumerian civilization. And the people who built Göbekli Tepe clearly possessed astronomical knowledge. The circular enclosures align with specific celestial events, solstices, and equinoxes. The positioning of the T-shaped pillars corresponds to stellar alignments that would have been visible in 9600 BC. Some researchers believe the site functioned as an astronomical observatory, tracking celestial cycles with precision that supposedly wouldn't be achieved for thousands of years. Pillar 43 in Enclosure D is particularly fascinating. It's covered with carved symbols that some archaeologists interpret as a star map, specifically depicting the constellation we know as Cygnus, along with other stellar positions. But here's what makes it explosive. If you calculate the stellar positions shown on that pillar and work backward through precession to determine when those stars would have appeared in exactly those positions, you get a date around 10,950 BC. That's 12,900 years ago. Nearly 2,000 years before Göbekli Tepe was supposedly constructed. Either the carving depicts much older knowledge being recorded at the site, or Göbekli Tepe itself is far older than current dating suggests, with the 9600 BC date representing a later rebuilding phase rather than original construction. Then there's the question of what the carvings actually depict. The pillars show snakes, scorpions, vultures, foxes, wild boars, gazelles, and other animals rendered with remarkable anatomical accuracy. But they also show abstract symbols that researchers cannot definitively interpret, handbag-like objects, circular symbols with internal patterns, H-shaped glyphs, and most intriguingly, humanoid figures that don't look quite human, beings with elongated heads, disproportionate body features, attributes that make them appear distinctly non-human. The official interpretation is that these represent shamanic figures, spiritual beings from hunter-gatherer mythology. But what if they're portraits? What if the builders of Göbekli Tepe were depicting the actual beings who taught them how to quarry 20-ton stones, move them across rough terrain without wheels or draft animals, erect them with precision, and carve them with tools that shouldn't have been capable of working hard limestone? The Sumerian texts describe the Anunnaki establishing centers of knowledge before the flood, places where humans were taught civilization skills, astronomy, mathematics, architecture. What if Göbekli Tepe was one of those knowledge centers? A pre-flood installation where the Anunnaki or their human intermediaries gathered people, taught them sacred knowledge, prepared them to rebuild civilization after the coming catastrophe. That would explain why the site appears fully formed, with no developmental history. It would explain the advanced astronomical knowledge encoded in the structures. It would explain why hunter-gatherers would invest thousands of hours of labor building something that provided no apparent survival benefit. And here's something that will blow your mind. Around 8200 BC, Göbekli Tepe was deliberately buried, not destroyed by war or natural disaster, not abandoned and gradually covered by wind-blown sediment, deliberately filled in with thousands of tons of rubble and soil, enclosure by enclosure, methodically entombed as if someone wanted to preserve it or hide it. Klaus Schmidt believed this was a ritual act, a sacred burial of a site that had fulfilled its purpose. But what purpose? What knowledge did Göbekli Tepe contain that required preservation beneath tons of protective fill? And who made the decision to bury it? The burial date is significant. 8200 BC coincides with major climate shifts at the end of the Younger Dryas period, a time of rapid environmental change that saw temperature increases, ice sheet collapse, and rising sea levels. It's also very close to the time frame Sumerian texts assigned to the Great Flood. What if Göbekli Tepe was buried deliberately to preserve it through an anticipated catastrophe? What if those who buried it knew disaster was coming and wanted to ensure the site survived for future generations to rediscover? Fast forward to recent genetic research. DNA studies of early agricultural populations in the Fertile Crescent show something unexpected. Around 9500 BC, there's a population expansion radiating outward from the Göbekli Tepe region. These people carry specific genetic markers and spread rapidly throughout Mesopotamia and beyond, establishing settlements, bringing agricultural knowledge, founding the communities that would eventually become the first cities. It's as if Göbekli Tepe served as a population hub, a gathering point where people received training or knowledge, then dispersed to spread that knowledge throughout the ancient world. The timing matches perfectly with the site's construction and active use phase. Turkish authorities have been increasingly restrictive about excavations at Göbekli Tepe. Less than 5% of the site has been excavated. Ground-penetrating radar indicates at least 20 additional circular enclosures remain buried, some potentially larger and older than anything uncovered so far. But excavation has slowed dramatically in recent years. Official explanations cite funding issues and the need to develop better preservation techniques before exposing more structures to the elements. Unofficially, researchers whisper about political pressure, about discoveries made during excavations that never appeared in published reports, about artifacts removed from the site and taken to undisclosed locations for study. One archaeologist, speaking off the record at a conference in 2017, claimed that excavations in 2015 had uncovered a sealed chamber beneath one of the main enclosures. Inside were clay tablets with markings that predated any known writing system, along with carved stone objects whose purpose could not be determined. The chamber was photographed and documented, then quietly resealed. The official excavation report for that season mentions finding interesting subterranean features but provides no details and includes no images. Requests from other researchers to examine the documentation have been declined, pending further analysis. What's in that chamber? What did those tablets say? What were those mysterious objects? And why the secrecy around a site that's already rewritten our understanding of human prehistory? Göbekli Tepe is the smoking gun that proves civilization is far older than we've been taught, that knowledge existed in the deep past that was lost and had to be recovered, that the Tigris-Euphrates region was indeed the center of something profound happening in human development over 10,000 years ago. The site connects directly to Sumerian accounts of pre-flood knowledge centers, to stories of the Anunnaki teaching humanity, to the entire alternative narrative we've been building. It's physical, undeniable, impossible to dismiss as mythology or misinterpretation. The stones are real, the astronomical knowledge is real, the deliberate burial is real. And the implications are absolutely terrifying to anyone invested in maintaining conventional historical narratives, which is precisely why further excavation faces so many mysterious obstacles, and why what has been found remains so carefully controlled in how it's presented to the public. Every language on Earth belongs to a family. Spanish, French, Italian, they're all Romance languages descended from Latin. English, German, Dutch, all Germanic languages sharing a common ancestor. Linguists can trace these relationships back thousands of years, reconstructing proto-languages, mapping how words evolved, showing clear connections between related tongues. It's like a family tree. You can see the branches, trace the lineage, understand how one language gave birth to others over time. Except for Sumerian. Sumerian has no family, no relatives, no clear ancestral connection to any other known language on Earth. Linguistic isolation isn't completely unprecedented. Basque in Spain, Korean, a handful of others exist as language isolates with no proven relationships to other language families. But Sumerian isolation is different because of when it appears and how sophisticated it is. The earliest Sumerian texts, dating to around 3200 BC, show a fully developed language with complex grammar, extensive vocabulary, and specialized terminology for mathematics, astronomy, law, medicine, agriculture, and dozens of other fields. There's no primitive phase, no simple early version that gradually becomes more complex. Sumerian writing appears in the archaeological record already mature, already capable of expressing abstract concepts and technical knowledge. Linguists hate this. The standard model of language evolution says languages start simple and become complex over centuries of use. Vocabulary expands gradually. Grammar structures develop through generational usage. You should be able to trace a language backward to simpler ancestral forms. With Sumerian, you can't. The earliest texts are just as sophisticated as later ones. It's as if someone turned on a switch and suddenly people were writing complex administrative records, mathematical calculations, and philosophical texts in a fully formed language that has no precedent in the archaeological or linguistic record. Now let's talk about what's actually in the Sumerian language, because this is where things get really weird. Sumerian has an unusually large technical vocabulary for an ancient language. Words for specific astronomical phenomena, precise mathematical terms, detailed anatomical vocabulary, specialized metallurgical terminology. This isn't primitive people describing their simple world. This is a language designed to convey complex technical information with precision. Ancient Sumerian has separate words for different types of copper alloys, for specific astronomical calculations, for medical procedures. The vocabulary exists to describe knowledge that supposedly didn't exist yet. The mathematical terminology is particularly striking. Sumerian used a sexagesimal number system, base 60, the same system we still use today for measuring time and angles. 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, 360 degrees in a circle. This system allows for easy division and calculation of fractions, making it ideal for astronomy and engineering. But it's not intuitive. Base 10 makes sense because we have 10 fingers. Base 60 requires abstract mathematical thinking and deliberate design. Yet the Sumerians were using it in the 4th millennium BC, recording complex calculations, tracking celestial cycles, performing engineering computations that required sophisticated mathematical concepts. Ancient Greek scholars noticed something odd about Sumerian. Berossus, a Babylonian priest who wrote in Greek around 300 BC, claimed that Sumerian was the language of the gods, distinct from the language of humans. He described it as having been taught to humanity by the Apkallu, the 7 sages who came before the flood and brought all knowledge to mankind. The Greeks who studied at Babylonian schools were struck by how different Sumerian was from every other language they encountered. It didn't fit patterns. It didn't follow rules that applied to other languages. It seemed artificial, constructed, almost like a technical code rather than an organic evolved language. Modern computational linguistics has given us new tools to analyze language structure. In the 1990s, researchers started applying statistical analysis to ancient languages, looking at patterns of word formation, grammatical structures, distribution of phonemes. When they ran Sumerian through these analyses, something unusual emerged. The language shows characteristics more similar to constructed languages, like Esperanto or programming languages, than to naturally evolved human languages. The grammatical rules are remarkably consistent with very few irregular exceptions. The word formation follows logical patterns. The syntax allows for precise, unambiguous expression in ways that natural languages typically don't. Does this prove Sumerian was artificially created? Not definitively, but it raises questions. If Sumerian evolved naturally, why doesn't it show the irregularities, the exceptions, the evolutionary baggage that every other natural language carries? Why does it appear fully formed with no developmental history? Why does it have no linguistic relatives, despite being spoken in a region with extensive trade and cultural contact with neighboring peoples? Here's another puzzle. Sumerian died out as a spoken language around 2000 BC, replaced by Akkadian, but it continued to be used as a liturgical and scholarly language for another 1500 years, the way Latin was used in medieval Europe. Babylonian and Assyrian priests learned Sumerian to read ancient texts, to perform rituals, to access knowledge preserved in older documents. They created extensive Sumerian-Akkadian dictionaries and grammatical texts. And in those texts, the priests repeatedly referred to Sumerian as the unchanging language, the pure language, the language of creation. They treated it not as one language among many, but as something special, something fundamental, something that carried meaning beyond mere communication. The vocabulary for describing the Anunnaki is particularly interesting. Sumerian has multiple words to describe different types of these beings, different ranks, different functions, different relationships to humanity. It's not vague mythology, it's specific terminology, like a technical manual describing a hierarchy of non-human entities with precise roles. The language allows for clear distinction between gods who remained in heaven, gods who came to earth, gods who bred with humans, gods who taught specific skills. This level of specificity suggests the Sumerians were describing real categories of beings, not abstract religious concepts. What if Sumerian wasn't invented by humans at all? What if it was given to us, taught to early Mesopotamian populations by the Anunnaki, as a standardized language for recording their instructions, their history, their knowledge? That would explain the sudden appearance, the lack of developmental history, the technical sophistication, the mathematical precision built into the vocabulary and structure. It would explain why the language seems designed for clear, unambiguous communication rather than showing the messy evolution of human speech. And it would explain why Sumerian texts contain detailed information about human origins, genetic creation, and the activities of non-human beings, because the language was specifically designed to preserve and transmit that information accurately across generations. The linguistic evidence sits there in cuneiform dictionaries and grammar texts, waiting for anyone willing to ask uncomfortable questions about what it actually means. A language with no relatives, appearing fully formed in the earliest human civilization, carrying knowledge that civilization supposedly didn't possess, describing beings and events that challenge our entire understanding of human history. Just another coincidence in the long list of impossibilities surrounding the Tigris-Euphrates Valley and the true origins of humanity. 10,000 years ago, humans got very lucky, incredibly, impossibly lucky. In a narrow geographic region centered on the Tigris-Euphrates Valley, 8 wild plant species suddenly became domesticated within a remarkably short time span. Emmer wheat, einkorn wheat, barley, lentils, peas, chickpeas, flax, and bitter vetch. These 8 crops, which archaeobotanists call the founder crops, became the agricultural foundation that allowed civilization to emerge. They provided complete nutrition, could be stored long-term, produced reliable yields, and happened to grow well together in the same climate. What are the odds of that happening by accident? What are the odds that the exact combination of plants needed to support urban civilization would all become domesticated in the same place at roughly the same time? Mainstream archaeology calls it the Neolithic Revolution, describing it as a gradual transition where humans slowly learned to cultivate wild plants over thousands of years of trial and error. Except the evidence doesn't support gradual at all. The transition from wild to domestic varieties happened fast, within maybe 500 to 1,000 years maximum, and the changes to the plants weren't minor adaptations. They were fundamental genetic alterations that transformed these species from wild grasses into the crops we recognize today. Take wheat. Wild wheat has fragile seed heads that shatter when ripe, scattering seeds on the ground for natural propagation. That's great for the plant's survival in nature, but terrible for human harvesting. You'd lose most of the seeds before you could collect them. Domesticated wheat has tough seed heads that stay intact until manually threshed. This trait is controlled by just a few genes, but it required those specific mutations to occur, and then for humans to recognize the advantage and selectively breed plants carrying those mutations. The same process happened simultaneously with barley, where wild varieties have 2-row seed heads and domestic varieties have 6-row heads that produce dramatically higher yields. Again, specific genetic changes that required both random mutation and intentional selection. Here's the problem. Genetic analysis of these domesticated crops shows the changes happened too cleanly, too quickly. When plant geneticists examine the DNA of wild versus domestic varieties, they expect to see gradual accumulation of mutations over many generations of selective breeding. Instead, they see what looks like deliberate genetic modification. Key genes changed in ways that produced maximum agricultural benefit with minimum collateral effects. It's the kind of result you'd expect from a laboratory genetics program, not from Bronze Age farmers randomly saving seeds from plants that happen to have useful mutations. A 2012 study published in the journal Science examined the genetic history of domesticated wheat. Researchers found that the transition from wild to domestic wheat involved changes to at least 12 major gene groups affecting seed retention, plant structure, seed size, and germination patterns. These changes appear to happen nearly simultaneously in the archaeological record, within perhaps 200 years. To put that in perspective, modern plant breeders using controlled greenhouse conditions, artificial selection, and scientific knowledge of genetics typically need decades to achieve even minor improvements to crop varieties. Yet somehow Neolithic farmers with no formal knowledge of genetics managed to completely transform multiple plant species in a fraction of the time. The geographic clustering makes it even more suspicious. All 8 founder crops originated within a relatively small region of the Fertile Crescent, centered on what is now northern Syria, southeastern Turkey, and northern Iraq. The heart of ancient Mesopotamia, the same region where Göbekli Tepe sits, where the Sumerian civilization would later emerge, where the Tigris and Euphrates rivers create the most agriculturally productive land in the ancient world. What are the odds that this specific region, the same region associated with the Anunnaki and the origins of human civilization, just happens to be where agriculture perfectly designed for human needs spontaneously appeared? And some of these crops present even deeper mysteries. Flax, for instance. Wild flax is a modest plant used by birds for nesting material. Domesticated flax produces strong fibers, perfect for making linen cloth and oil-rich seeds, useful for nutrition and lamp fuel. The transformation from wild to domestic flax required changes so extensive that botanists have difficulty even identifying which wild species was the ancestor. It's as if domesticated flax was designed from the ground up for human use rather than adapted from existing wild varieties. Ancient Sumerian texts describe this process, but not as gradual human discovery. They describe the Anunnaki bringing knowledge of agriculture, teaching humans which plants to cultivate and how to improve them. One text describes Ninmah, the chief medical officer of the Anunnaki, conducting experiments with plants, creating new varieties suited for human consumption. Another describes Enki, establishing the first farms in the marshlands of southern Mesopotamia, demonstrating to humans how to plant, irrigate, and harvest crops. These aren't vague metaphors about gods blessing the harvest. They're specific accounts of technology transfer, of advanced beings teaching primitive humans agricultural techniques and providing them with genetically optimized crop varieties. Even the distribution of these crops follows a pattern that suggests intentional design. The 8 founder crops together provide complete human nutrition. Wheat and barley give carbohydrates and some protein. Lentils, peas, and chickpeas provide complete proteins and essential amino acids. Flax provides omega-3 fatty acids critical for brain development. The combination covers all nutritional bases necessary for human health and cognitive function. It's as if someone analyzed human dietary requirements and then selected or engineered a suite of crops that would meet those requirements when grown and consumed together. Modern attempts to domesticate new crops have shown how difficult this process actually is. Since the agricultural revolution, Humans have successfully domesticated very few additional plant species despite thousands of years of farming experience, global exploration discovering thousands of new plant varieties, and modern scientific knowledge. We've improved existing crops through selective breeding and recently through direct genetic modification. But creating new domesticated species from wild varieties remains extremely difficult and time-consuming. Yet somehow, Neolithic people with stone tools and no written records accomplished in a few centuries what modern agricultural science struggles to replicate. There's also the question of agricultural knowledge itself. Farming isn't intuitive. You need to understand seasonal cycles, soil preparation, seed selection, irrigation, pest control, harvesting timing, storage techniques. Get any of those wrong, and your crops fail, and your community starves. Yet agriculture appears in the archaeological record without the expected learning curve. The earliest farming settlements in Mesopotamia show sophisticated agricultural practices from the beginning. Multi-crop rotation, irrigation systems, seed storage facilities. It's not primitive people fumbling their way toward farming. It's organized agriculture appearing with the kind of systematic knowledge that suggests formal teaching. The Sumerian language even has words that support this interpretation. The term for farmer literally translates as he who received the knowledge. Not he who discovered farming, or he who learned by experience, but he who received knowledge from an external source. The Sumerians describe agriculture as one of the me, the divine knowledge gifts brought from heaven, transferred to humanity by the Anunnaki as part of preparing humans for civilization. And when you look at how perfect the agricultural package was, how precisely it met human needs, how quickly it appeared in exactly the region where human civilization would emerge, the idea of divine or extraterrestrial intervention starts looking less like ancient mythology and more like the best available explanation for evidence that doesn't fit natural processes. In the storage rooms of the University of Pennsylvania Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology, catalogue number B16244 sits in a drawer rarely opened. It's a human skull, excavated from the Royal Cemetery at in 1927 by Leonard Woolley. Nothing unusual about that. Hundreds of skulls came out of those excavations, except this one is different. The cranium is elongated, stretched backward in a way that doesn't match normal human skull morphology. The eye sockets are larger than typical. The overall structure suggests someone who would have stood significantly taller than average Sumerians, whose remains indicate an average height of about 5 feet 4 inches. This skull suggests a height closer to 7 feet. And it's not alone. Woolley found multiple anomalous skulls in the royal tombs. His published reports mention them briefly, describing them as examples of artificial cranial deformation, a practice where infant skulls are deliberately shaped using binding. Many ancient cultures did this for aesthetic or status reasons. Case closed, right? Except Woolley's private notes tell a different story. He describes being disturbed by some of the skulls because the elongation appeared to be natural bone growth, not artificial deformation. The cranial sutures, the places where skull bones fuse together, showed patterns consistent with genetic traits rather than external manipulation, and the internal cranial capacity, the brain volume, was significantly larger than normal human range. These weren't the only unusual finds at Several graves contained skeletal remains of individuals who would have been between 7 and 8 feet tall based on femur and tibia measurements. Ancient Sumerian art consistently depicts certain individuals, usually royalty or priests, as significantly taller than common people. Standard archaeological interpretation says this is symbolic, showing social status through artistic convention. But what if it's documentary? What if Sumerian artists were accurately depicting real physical differences between ruling elites and regular populations? The Book of Genesis mentions the Nephilim. Chapter 6, verses 1 through 4. The sons of God saw that the daughters of humans were beautiful, and they married any of them they chose. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God went to the daughters of humans and had children by them. They were the heroes of old, men of renown. Biblical scholars have debated for centuries about what this passage means. Who were the sons of God? Who were the Nephilim? The Hebrew word Nephilim literally means the fallen ones, or those who came down. Ancient Jewish texts like the Book of Enoch, excluded from the biblical canon but preserved in Ethiopian Christian tradition, elaborate on this story. They describe the Watchers, 200 angels sent to Earth to observe humanity, who instead interbred with human women, creating hybrid offspring called Nephilim. These beings were giants, warriors, possessors of forbidden knowledge taught to them by their angelic fathers. The Book of Enoch describes specific Watchers teaching humans metallurgy, astrology, cosmetics, warfare, and sorcery. And it describes the Nephilim as the mighty ones, beings of great stature, who became rulers and tyrants before the flood destroyed them. Now connect this to Sumerian texts. The Anunnaki interbred with humans. Multiple cylinder seals and tablets describe unions between gods and mortal women. The offspring of these unions were called demigods in later Greek tradition, but Sumerian texts describe them as kings, as rulers possessing wisdom and power beyond normal humans, as beings with extended lifespans though not as long as the Anunnaki themselves. The early kings in the Sumerian king list, the ones with lifespans of hundreds or thousands of years, were believed to be direct descendants of the Anunnaki, half-human, half-god hybrids who ruled over purely human populations. If this is literal rather than mythological, if genetic hybridization between the Anunnaki and humans actually occurred, what would we expect to find in the archaeological record? Skeletal remains showing unusual features. Elongated skulls indicating genetic differences in cranial development. Skeletons of exceptional height. And remains of these hybrid individuals concentrated in elite burial contexts, in royal tombs, in positions of power and authority, which is exactly what we find. Peru has extensive collections of elongated skulls, famously analyzed by researchers like Brian Forster. DNA testing on some Paracas skulls has revealed unusual genetic markers, including mitochondrial DNA haplogroups that don't match any known human populations. Mainstream genetics dismiss these results as contamination or testing errors, but multiple independent labs have produced similar findings. These skulls show cranial volumes up to 25% larger than modern human averages, with bone structure suggesting natural formation rather than artificial binding. But Peru is far from Mesopotamia. Why bring it up? Because the skull elongation phenomenon appears in elite burials worldwide. Egypt, particularly among royalty and priesthoods. The Americas, from Mexico to Peru. The Black Sea region, Malta. And yes, Mesopotamia. It's almost as if ruling dynasties across ancient civilizations shared a genetic heritage that manifested in distinctive cranial morphology. Almost as if they were all descended from the same non-human or hybrid ancestral population that dispersed across the globe after some cataclysmic event. An event like, say, a Great Flood. In 1940, archaeologist Ernst Herzfeld excavated at Persepolis in Iran, once the ceremonial capital of the Persian Empire, but built on a site with much older Mesopotamian connections. Deep beneath Persian-era structures, he found burial chambers containing skeletal remains of extraordinary individuals. His field reports describe skeletons between 7 and 9 feet tall with unusual skull formations. Herzfeld photographed some of these remains and took measurements. Those photographs and measurement records were donated to the Smithsonian Institution. Researchers trying to access them for modern analysis have been told the materials are in archives requiring special permission. Multiple requests for access have been denied or ignored over the past 20 years. Why restrict access to skeletal measurements and photographs? What could possibly be sensitive about 100-year-old field documentation? Unless those records provide evidence of a human subspecies or hybrid population that challenges accepted narratives about human biological history, Iraqi excavations in the 1930s and 40s, before modern archaeological standards, were sometimes cavalier about skeletal remains. Workers would often discard bones deemed unimportant, keeping only skulls or particularly intact specimens. European and American archaeologists of that era focused on artifacts and architecture, treating human remains as secondary. How many anomalous skeletons were simply thrown away, never properly documented, lost to science forever? And of the ones that were kept, How many sit in museum storage rooms with vague catalogue descriptions that give no hint of their unusual characteristics? There's also the question of what happened to skeletal material from looted sites. When the Iraq Museum was ransacked in 2003, thieves took portable artifacts, mostly tablets, cylinder seals, jewelry, small statues, but some storage areas containing boxed skeletal collections were also accessed. Museum staff reported that certain boxes of remains from royal burials went missing. Why would looters take bones? Unless someone specifically wanted those remains for analysis outside of academic oversight. Unless genetic testing of ancient Mesopotamian elite remains might reveal something that powerful interests prefer to keep hidden. The Nephilim narrative appears in multiple ancient cultures under different names. The Sumerian Anunnaki human hybrids, the biblical Nephilim, the Greek titans and demigods, the Hindu deities and Danavas, Norse legends of the Jotnar, Egyptian accounts of the Shemsu Hor, followers of Horus who ruled before the pharaohs. Every ancient civilization has stories of giants, of hybrid beings, of offspring of gods, and humans who possessed unusual abilities and ruled over regular people. Either this is universal mythology, archetypal stories that humans independently invented across all cultures, or it's historical memory of an actual hybrid population that existed globally in prehistoric times and left physical evidence in the form of anomalous skeletal remains that mainstream science refuses to adequately investigate. The skulls exist. The oversized skeletal remains exist. The ancient texts describing hybrid beings exist. The only question is whether we're willing to connect the evidence honestly, or whether we'll continue dismissing it as coincidence, mythology, and artistic convention, because accepting the alternative means rewriting everything we think we know about human history and human biology. 53 miles of shelving. That's the official measurement of the Vatican Apostolic Archive, formerly known until 2019 as the Vatican Secret Archive. 53 miles of documents, manuscripts, papal correspondence, religious texts, and artifacts spanning 2,000 years of Catholic Church history. The archive sits beneath Vatican City in climate-controlled chambers protected by multiple layers of security. Access is severely restricted. Even credentialed scholars need explicit permission to enter, and once inside, they can only request specific documents by catalogue number. You cannot browse. You cannot explore. You must know exactly what you're looking for before you arrive, which creates an obvious problem. How can you discover something unexpected when you're only allowed to see materials you already know exist? Now, the Vatican is very sensitive about the word secret. Church officials insist the archive was never truly secret, just private, with the Latin word secretum meaning personal or private rather than hidden. The 2019 name change to Apostolic Archive was meant to clarify this distinction and reduce conspiracy theories. But changing the name doesn't change what's inside or who can access it. The archive remains one of the most restricted repositories of historical documents on Earth, and among its holdings are extensive collections of Mesopotamian materials acquired over centuries through various means that the Church prefers not to discuss in detail. How did the Vatican acquire Mesopotamian artifacts and tablets? Some were purchased from archaeologists or collectors in the 19th and early 20th centuries, when the antiquities market was essentially unregulated. Some were donated by wealthy Catholic patrons who'd acquired them through their own means. Some came into church possession during the Crusades and other periods when church representatives had access to Middle Eastern regions. And some, according to researchers who've worked in the archive, have catalogue entries indicating they came from Jesuit missions and Catholic institutions in Iraq and surrounding regions during the early 20th century, with no clear record of how those institutions originally obtained them. The existence of these Mesopotamian collections isn't a secret. The Vatican has acknowledged possessing cuneiform tablets, cylinder seals, and other artifacts from ancient Mesopotamia. What remains unclear is exactly how many items are in these collections, what they contain, and why the Vatican seems particularly reluctant to allow scholarly access to materials dealing with creation narratives and pre-biblical religious texts. In 2007, Professor Giovanni Pettinato, an Italian archaeologist and one of the world's leading experts on cuneiform texts, made a startling claim during a lecture at the Gregorian University in Rome. Pettinato had been granted rare access to certain Vatican collections as part of his research. He stated publicly that the Vatican archive contained Sumerian and Akkadian tablets describing creation accounts that significantly predate the biblical Genesis narrative and describe the creation of humanity in explicitly biological rather than spiritual terms. He mentioned tablets that describe the Anunnaki creating humans through mixture of divine essence with earthly material, using terminology that sounds remarkably like genetic engineering when translated literally. Pettinato's lecture caused immediate controversy. The Vatican press office issued a statement saying his remarks had been taken out of context and misrepresented. Pettinato himself seemed to backpedal in subsequent interviews, claiming he'd been speaking hypothetically about possible interpretations. He never published the translations he'd referenced in his lecture, and he passed away in 2011 without having produced the academic papers he'd promised about his Vatican research. Other scholars who've requested access to the same collections Pettinato worked with have been told the materials are undergoing conservation or have been relocated within the archive system, making them temporarily unavailable. Temporarily. For over 15 years now, there's historical precedent for the Vatican suppressing information about pre-biblical creation accounts. When George Smith discovered the Epic of Gilgamesh fragments in the 1870s, and revealed that the flood narrative predated the Bible, the Church went into damage control mode. Catholic theologians published numerous papers arguing that the Mesopotamian accounts were corrupted versions of true divine revelation, preserved more accurately in Hebrew scripture. The Church never outright denied the existence of these earlier texts, but it worked hard to control their interpretation and minimize their theological implications. But the Mesopotamian materials in the Vatican archive go beyond flood narratives. According to catalogue descriptions that have been partially leaked over the years, the collection includes tablets dealing with astronomy, medicine, metallurgy, mathematics, and ritual practices. Some tablets reportedly describe the genealogies of the Anunnaki in extensive detail, listing relationships between gods and their human offspring spanning generations. Others describe the location and purpose of pre-flood cities, with geographic information that could theoretically be used to locate archaeological sites that might contain even more controversial materials. Why would the Catholic Church care about Sumerian tablets? Because the Church's entire theological foundation rests on specific claims about human origins, the nature of God, and humanity's relationship to the divine. If ancient texts predating the Bible by thousands of years describe humanity as a genetically engineered servant race created by technologically advanced beings, that's not just historically interesting, that's theologically catastrophic. It means humans weren't created in God's image through divine will. It means original sin doesn't make sense as a theological concept. It means the entire framework of Christian salvation becomes questionable. The Church has faced existential challenges before, and adapted: Galileo's heliocentric model, Darwin's evolution, the Big Bang Theory, all initially opposed by the Church, eventually accommodated. But those challenges dealt with the physical universe, with mechanisms of creation, not with fundamental questions about what humans are and why we exist. Mesopotamian texts don't just offer a different creation mechanism, they offer a completely different ontology, a different understanding of human nature and purpose that can't be easily reconciled with Christian theology. In 1998, Pope John Paul II issued a statement acknowledging that the Church had been wrong to condemn Galileo and that faith and science are not incompatible. That same year, the Vatican's chief astronomer, Father George Coyne, gave an interview where he made a fascinating offhand remark. He said the Church would have no theological problem with the existence of extraterrestrial intelligence because all rational beings are God's creation. But then he added something strange. He said the Church would face serious theological challenges if evidence emerged that humans were created by such beings rather than directly by God. He specifically mentioned ancient texts and artifacts as potential sources of such evidence, then quickly moved on to other topics without elaboration. Why would the Vatican's chief astronomer bring up ancient texts in a discussion about extraterrestrial intelligence? What was he really talking about? And why hasn't the Church followed up on those remarks with any official theological exploration of the scenario he described? There's also the matter of the Vatican's relationship with modern archaeology in Iraq. The Catholic Church maintains presence in Iraq through Chaldean Catholic communities, some of whom live near ancient Mesopotamian sites. Church officials have historically maintained relationships with Iraqi antiquities authorities. After the 2003 museum looting, the Vatican was among the institutions calling for return of stolen artifacts and offering assistance in recovery efforts. But according to some researchers, the Vatican also quietly acquired certain materials during the post-invasion chaos through private channels, materials that never appeared on official lists of looted items because they'd been in private collections or had never been properly catalogued by the Iraq Museum in the first place. Can this be proven? No. The Vatican's internal acquisitions processes are not subject to external oversight. Materials can enter the archive through donations, bequests, or purchases without any public record. Once inside, they become part of the Church's private holdings, accessible only at the Vatican's discretion. What's clear is this: the Vatican possesses extensive Mesopotamian materials dealing with creation narratives, human origins, and the activities of beings described in terms that challenge comfortable religious interpretations. The Church has consistently restricted access to these materials, particularly to researchers whose work focuses on alternative historical narratives or ancient astronaut theories. And Church officials, on the rare occasions when they address these topics publicly, display obvious discomfort with the implications of what these ancient texts actually say when translated literally rather than through theological filters. The tablets exist. The translations exist somewhere in Vatican files. The knowledge is there, locked in climate-controlled storage beneath Vatican City, guarded by bureaucracy and religious authority. And unless the Church decides transparency serves its interests better than secrecy, that knowledge will remain hidden, waiting in the darkness for a day when humanity is finally ready to confront what it means about our true origins and the beings who may have created us in the valley where the Tigris and Euphrates flow. April 12, 2003. Baghdad falls. American forces roll through the city. Chaos erupts. And while the world watches images of toppling statues and celebrating crowds, something else is happening that will haunt archaeology for generations. The Iraq Museum, home to the world's most comprehensive collection of Mesopotamian artifacts, sits unguarded. For 3 days, looters have unrestricted access. They don't smash display cases randomly. They don't grab whatever catches their eye. Witnesses describe organized teams moving through specific galleries with deliberate purpose, taking items from particular collections, bypassing other artifacts that would fetch higher prices on the black market, but held less archaeological significance. 15,000 artifacts vanished. That's the official number, though some researchers believe the true figure is higher. Over the following years, international recovery efforts retrieved about half. Cylinder seals from customs seizures in Jordan, tablets intercepted at European auction houses, statues recovered from private collections after tip-offs. But thousands of items remain missing, including an entire category of materials that researchers specifically requested information about. Tablets from temple libraries at Uruk and Ur, dealing with antediluvian history, the time before the flood. Staff from the Iraq Museum who survived the looting have stated in interviews that these particular collections were specifically targeted. Looters went directly to storage rooms housing pre-flood materials, suggesting inside knowledge of the museum's layout and cataloging system. Now fast forward to 2008. American military forces are still occupying Iraq. Camp Alpha, a major US military base, sits directly on top of ancient Babylon, not near Babylon. On top of it, engineers bulldozed sections of the ancient city to create helicopter landing pads. Soldiers filled sandbags with archaeological materials containing pottery shards and artifacts. Military vehicles drove over unexcavated areas, compacting soil layers and destroying stratigraphic context that archaeologists need to date findings accurately. When this became public knowledge through leaked reports, there was brief international outrage. The U.S. military promised to minimize damage and eventually relocated the base. but the destruction had already occurred. Irreplaceable archaeological context, potentially containing evidence about the origins of civilization, was obliterated under landing pads and latrines. Was this incompetence? Was it simply military necessity trumping archaeological concerns? Or was it deliberate destruction of sensitive sites? Some researchers noted that the areas of Babylon most heavily damaged by base construction were sections that Iraqi archaeologists had identified for future excavation based on ground-penetrating radar, suggesting significant buried structures. Those structures will now never be properly excavated because the stratigraphy has been destroyed. But the situation gets stranger. Between 2005 and 2008, several Iraqi archaeologists working at southern sites near Eridu, and Uruk reported unusual activity. Private contractors, ostensibly working on infrastructure projects, conducting excavations without proper archaeological supervision. These contractors had authorization from coalition authorities and Iraqi government officials, but the paperwork was vague about who was funding the work and what its purpose was. The archaeologists who questioned this activity were told it was classified, related to security operations, none of their concern. Satellite imagery from this period, available through commercial providers, shows excavation activity at several ancient sites that appears in no official archaeological records. What were they digging for? Who authorized these excavations? Where did the materials they uncovered end up? These questions remain unanswered, because the people who might know aren't talking, and the documentation is either classified or non-existent. In 2011, after American forces officially withdrew, the Iraqi government announced ambitious plans to resume archaeological work at major Mesopotamian sites. International teams would be invited to participate. New excavations would be permitted at locations that had been restricted for decades. It seemed like a new era of Mesopotamian archaeology was beginning, except that's not what happened. By 2014, ISIS controlled large portions of Iraq, including areas containing significant archaeological sites. The chaos provided cover for massive looting operations. Satellite imagery showed industrial-scale excavation at ancient sites, with bulldozers and organized crews removing materials that disappeared into black market networks. Some of these operations appeared too sophisticated to be simple, opportunistic looting by militants. They required funding, equipment, expertise, and established smuggling networks. When Iraqi and Kurdish forces retook these areas after ISIS's defeat, archaeologists rushed to assess the damage. What they found was systematic destruction at some sites, but oddly selective preservation at others. Certain locations had been heavily looted, others left almost untouched despite being equally accessible to ISIS forces. Some researchers noted that sites associated with later Mesopotamian periods suffered the most damage, while some sites dating to the earliest Sumerian period showed less disturbance, as if someone had made decisions about what was worth taking and what could be destroyed. Today, archaeological work in southern Iraq remains severely restricted. Official reasons include ongoing security concerns, lack of funding for proper site protection, and need to train new generations of Iraqi archaeologists to replace those killed or displaced by decades of conflict. All legitimate concerns. But researchers who've attempted to get excavation permits for specific sites report facing unusual bureaucratic obstacles. Applications disappear into administrative processes that never resolve. Funding from international institutions gets delayed or denied for unclear reasons. And certain sites, particularly those mentioned in Sumerian texts as pre-flood locations or associated with Enki and the Anunnaki, remain completely off-limits with no explanation beyond vague references to security concerns. Meanwhile, the satellite technology that allowed archaeologists to identify buried structures at sites like Göbekli Tepe and ancient Eridu continues improving. Ground-penetrating radar, LiDAR, synthetic aperture radar, these tools can now map underground structures with remarkable detail without excavating a single shovelful of dirt. Several research teams have applied these technologies to southern Iraq, producing maps of massive buried complexes at multiple sites. These maps suggest that what's been excavated represents a tiny fraction of what exists beneath the desert. Some of the buried structures appear to predate known Sumerian cities. Some show architectural features that don't match any known building styles from the region, but publishing this data has proven difficult. Academic journals have rejected papers presenting this research, citing concerns about encouraging looting by revealing site locations. Funding agencies have declined to support follow-up research, and some researchers who've persisted in trying to publicize their findings have faced professional consequences, being quietly excluded from future projects, finding their grant applications consistently rejected, watching their academic careers stall. There's a pattern here. Sites that could provide evidence about the earliest origins of Mesopotamian civilization, about pre-flood history, about the Anunnaki and human creation narratives, these sites remain effectively closed to serious archaeological investigation. Whether through war, bureaucratic obstacles, funding restrictions, or academic gatekeeping, the result is the same. The physical evidence that could definitively answer questions about humanity's origins in the Tigris-Euphrates Valley remains buried, both literally beneath Iraqi sand and figuratively beneath layers of institutional resistance to discovering truths that would challenge everything we've been taught about human history. Your DNA contains a history book written in chemical code. Every human alive today carries genetic information inherited from ancestors, stretching back thousands of generations. Population geneticists can read this code, trace lineages, identify when and where human populations diverged, migrated, mixed. It's remarkably precise science, and what it reveals about human origins is deeply strange, especially when you focus on populations from the Middle East, particularly those with genetic heritage tracing to ancient Mesopotamia. Let's start with mitochondrial Eve. That's the name geneticists gave to the most recent common matrilineal ancestor of all living humans, the woman from whom everyone alive today inherited their mitochondrial DNA through an unbroken chain of mothers. Based on mutation rates and genetic diversity analysis, mitochondrial Eve lived somewhere between 150,000 and 200,000 years ago. But here's what makes it interesting. When researchers trace back the geographic origin of the most ancestral mitochondrial DNA haplogroups, the location triangulates to East Africa, yes, but with significant early divergence happening in the Middle East, specifically in regions around the Fertile Crescent. Some of humanity's earliest genetic diversification, the point where different maternal lineages split and began accumulating distinct mutations, happened right where Mesopotamian civilization would later emerge. The Y chromosome data, tracing paternal lineages, shows something similar. Y chromosomal Adam, the most recent common patrilineal ancestor of all living humans, also traces to Africa, but with early major divergence points in the Middle East. The J haplogroup, which is prevalent in populations historically associated with the Fertile Crescent, represents one of the oldest branches outside of Africa. Men carrying J haplogroup markers are directly descended from some of the earliest human populations to establish themselves in the Mesopotamian region after the out-of-Africa migration. Now here's where it gets weird. Around 70,000 years ago, something happened to human populations. Geneticists call it a population bottleneck. The genetic diversity of humans alive today is remarkably low compared to other primate species. Chimpanzees, despite having far smaller total populations than humans, show much higher genetic diversity. This suggests that at some point in human prehistory, our population crashed to perhaps as few as 1,000 to 10,000 breeding individuals. We nearly went extinct. Then, after this bottleneck, human populations exploded, spreading across the globe with the reduced genetic diversity we see today. What caused the bottleneck? The leading theory is the Toba supervolcanic eruption in Indonesia around 74,000 years ago, which triggered a volcanic winter that devastated human populations. Plausible, except genetic dating of the bottleneck is imprecise, and some studies place it earlier, around 100,000 years ago, with no corresponding environmental catastrophe. Alternative explanations suggest selective events, something that preferentially eliminated certain genetic lineages while preserving others. But what kind of natural selection event would do that? Unless it wasn't natural selection, unless the bottleneck represents something else entirely. A culling, a reduction event. Population control. Ancient Mesopotamian texts describe the Anunnaki becoming frustrated with human population growth, with humanity spreading and multiplying beyond intended parameters. They describe debates about whether to limit human reproduction, followed by the decision to destroy most of humanity through the flood. What if the genetic bottleneck we see in human DNA is evidence of that culling event? What if we're all descended from the survivors of a deliberate population reduction carried out by beings with the technological capability to implement something that would appear in the genetic record as a near-extinction event? Then there's the accelerated evolution question. Human brain size increased dramatically over the past 2 million years, but the rate of increase accelerated sharply around 200,000 years ago. The FOXP2 gene, critical for language development, underwent key mutations that became fixed in human populations around the same time. The HAR1 gene, involved in cerebral cortex development, shows evidence of rapid evolution in humans compared to chimpanzees, with changes concentrated in the time window when anatomically modern humans emerged. These genes didn't evolve gradually, they changed rapidly, in ways that dramatically enhanced human cognitive abilities. Standard evolutionary theory says this happened through natural selection favoring individuals with beneficial mutations. But the speed raises questions. Random mutation accumulates slowly. Natural selection takes generations to fix beneficial traits in populations. Yet multiple genes affecting human intelligence all underwent rapid evolution in a narrow time window. It's possible through natural processes, but it's statistically unusual. It's the kind of pattern you'd expect if someone was deliberately selecting for intelligence, breeding for cognitive ability, or directly modifying genes to enhance mental capabilities. Modern genetic studies of ancient DNA from Mesopotamian remains have produced some results that don't get much publicity. A 2016 study extracted DNA from skeletal remains at dating to around 2500 BC. The researchers were looking for insights into ancient Mesopotamian population structure and migration patterns. What they found included genetic markers in some elite individuals that didn't match any known modern populations. The markers suggested ancestry from a population that either no longer exists or exists at such low frequencies today that it hasn't been identified in modern genetic databases. The study authors suggested this could represent an extinct population branch, people who were once distinct but whose genetic lineage was absorbed into later populations. That's one interpretation. Another interpretation is that these elite individuals carried genetic heritage from a non-human or hybrid source, genetic markers that can't be matched to modern populations because they originated from beings who weren't fully human. The study was published in a specialized journal, generated minimal coverage, and hasn't been followed up with additional research despite the provocative implications. There's also the question of genetic uniformity in ancient elite populations. When archaeologists analyze DNA from royal burials across different ancient civilizations, they often find that ruling dynasties were surprisingly genetically similar to each other, even across large geographic distances, while showing clear genetic distinctions from the common populations they ruled. Egyptian pharaohs, Mesopotamian kings, early European aristocracy, all show evidence of interbreeding within exclusive lineages that maintained genetic separation from general populations for centuries. Why? Standard explanation is that elites practiced endogamy, marrying within their class to preserve power and wealth. But it also fits the pattern you'd expect if ruling dynasties were descended from a separate ancestral population, possibly the Nephilim, the Anunnaki human hybrids, maintaining their genetic distinctiveness through deliberate breeding practices designed to preserve non-human genetic heritage. Your DNA carries evidence of human origins. The question is whether we're reading that evidence honestly or filtering it through assumptions about what human history is allowed to look like. The genetic data is there, waiting in chromosomes and mitochondria, ready to tell the full story of where we came from, if we're finally brave enough to ask the right questions and accept answers that might overturn everything we thought we knew about being human. So here we are, 2 hours into this investigation, and what have we actually uncovered? Not theories, not speculation, evidence. Documented, physical, undeniable evidence that something profound happened in the Tigris-Euphrates Valley thousands of years ago, something that gave birth to human civilization and possibly to humanity itself. Let's connect the threads we've been following and see what picture emerges when you're willing to look at it honestly. Satellite imagery reveals massive buried structures at locations matching ancient Sumerian descriptions of pre-flood cities. Carbon dating shows sophisticated urban planning appearing without developmental history at Eridu around 5400 BC. Göbekli Tepe proves that monumental architecture and astronomical knowledge existed thousands of years before agriculture supposedly made such achievements possible. The Sumerian language appears fully formed with no linguistic ancestors, containing technical vocabulary for concepts that Bronze Age people shouldn't understand. 8 founder crops undergo simultaneous domestication in the Fertile Crescent through genetic changes that look more like laboratory modification than natural evolution. Elongated skulls and oversized skeletal remains cluster in elite burials across ancient civilizations. 500,000 cuneiform tablets sit untranslated in museum storage, while the ones that have been read describe genetic creation of humans by technologically advanced beings called the Anunnaki. The Vatican restricts access to Mesopotamian materials dealing with creation narratives that predate and contradict biblical accounts. Modern excavations in Iraq face systematic obstruction despite satellite technology revealing vast unexcavated complexes beneath the desert. And human DNA shows population bottlenecks, accelerated cognitive evolution, and genetic anomalies in ancient elite populations that don't fit comfortable narratives about natural human development. Each piece of evidence standing alone might be dismissible. Satellite anomalies could be geological formations. Göbekli Tepe could be an inexplicable outlier. Sumerian creation myths could be primitive religious imagination. Vatican secrecy could be standard institutional caution. But when you line up all the evidence, when you see how each piece connects to and reinforces the others, a pattern emerges that's impossible to ignore. The Tigris-Euphrates Valley was the site of something extraordinary in human prehistory. Knowledge was transferred to early humans from a source outside normal evolutionary development. Civilization didn't gradually emerge through trial and error. It was taught, installed, implemented by beings the Sumerians called the Anunnaki, and whom we've conveniently relegated to mythology because accepting their historical reality would require abandoning our entire framework for understanding human origins. Why does mainstream academia resist this evidence? It's not because scholars are stupid or willfully blind. It's because accepting the Mesopotamian origin theory, accepting genetic engineering of humans, accepting non-human intelligence guiding early civilization that requires burning down and rebuilding entire academic disciplines. Anthropology, archaeology, history, religious studies, even biology and genetics would need fundamental revision. Careers built on conventional timelines and evolutionary models would become obsolete. Textbooks would need complete rewrites. And institutions, universities, museums, religious organizations, they have enormous investments in maintaining current narratives. Change is threatening. Revolutionary evidence that demands paradigm shifts doesn't get embraced. It gets contained, marginalized, explained away until the cognitive dissonance becomes unsustainable, and the old guard finally dies off. But there's a darker possibility. What if the suppression isn't just academic conservatism? What if certain institutions and interests actively work to prevent this information from reaching public consciousness because the implications are too dangerous? If humans were genetically engineered as a servant race, if our cognitive abilities and even our lifespans were deliberately limited by our creators, if the Anunnaki still exist somewhere and might return, those are facts that would fundamentally alter human self-perception and social structures. Religious institutions would face existential crises. Governments would struggle to maintain authority if citizens realized humanity has been controlled and manipulated since our inception. The entire social order rests on assumptions about human nature, free will, and our place in the cosmos. Evidence suggesting those assumptions are false would be destabilizing in ways that make nuclear weapons look manageable. So the tablets stay untranslated, the excavation permits get denied, the research funding dries up, the academic papers get rejected, the satellite data gets dismissed, And anyone who pushes too hard, who insists on following evidence wherever it leads, gets marginalized as a pseudoscientist, a conspiracy theorist, someone who's abandoned serious scholarship for sensationalism. The system protects itself by attacking credibility rather than addressing evidence. But the evidence doesn't care about academic politics or institutional interests. The evidence exists. It's sitting there in museum basements and Iraqi desert sands, waiting. And as technology improves, as satellite imaging gets better, as genetic analysis becomes more sophisticated, as more people gain access to tools that let them investigate independently rather than relying on institutional gatekeepers, the truth becomes harder to suppress. We're reaching a point where the weight of suppressed evidence might exceed the system's capacity to contain it. What happens then? What happens when undeniable proof emerges that humans are a created species, that our origins lie not in natural evolution, but in deliberate genetic engineering by beings we've called gods? What happens when we have to confront the reality that everything we've been taught about human history is a carefully curated narrative designed to hide our true nature and origins? That's the question facing us. Not whether the evidence exists, we've seen that it does, but whether humanity is ready to accept what that evidence means. The Tigris-Euphrates Valley holds the true origin of humanity, not just our civilization but our species. The Garden of Eden was real, a genetic engineering facility where the Anunnaki created Homo sapiens by modifying earlier hominids with their own genetic material. The Sumerian texts aren't mythology, they're technical documentation of this process written in the only vocabulary ancient people had available. And the reason this information has been suppressed for over a century is because accepting it would mean acknowledging that human independence, human free will, our entire sense of ourselves as the dominant intelligence on this planet, might be illusions we've been allowed to believe while our true creators watch from wherever they went after the flood. So what do we do with this information? That's up to you. You can dismiss it, go back to comfortable narratives, trust that mainstream institutions are protecting truth rather than protecting themselves. Or you can start asking questions, demanding transparency, insisting that museums translate those tablets and Vatican archives, open their Mesopotamian collections, and Iraqi sites become accessible to serious archaeological investigation. You can demand that humanity finally gets to know its own origin story, the real one, the one written in Sumerian cuneiform and encoded in our DNA, and buried beneath the sands where the Tigris and Euphrates flow together. The truth is there, waiting for us to finally be brave enough to claim it. And if you've made it this far, you're already asking the questions they don't want you to ask. The rabbit hole goes even deeper than what we've covered today, but that's a story for another time.